it also corresponds to other findings from related fields of scientific research that have shown, for example, that things like distractibility, for example, increase the brain's aging, or even our biological aging mechanisms. So there's something called telomeres, for example, which are the caps on the end of chromosomes, and those basically get shorter and shorter as we age, and you can measure them as a biological marker of the aging process.
Welcome back to Against the Herd, where we explore unconventional approaches that lead to unconventional results. And if you're just now joining us and you haven't listened to our previous episode on meditation, I encourage you to listen to some of the research that we pulled out. But today's guest is Dr. Cortland Dahl, and Cortland has spent much of his time in research in parts of East Asia. He is now one of the leading researchers and neuroscientists at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. He is the co-founder of Tergar International. He is the founder and CEO of Healthy Minds. He has published 12 books and numerous articles in scientific journals on meditation. This is a phenomenal podcast. We learned so much, and we hope you enjoy it. Let's get into it.
Against the Herd podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest with us, Dr. Cortland Dahl. Thank you very much for joining us today, Mr. Cortland. Just wanted to give a brief background on, we've covered a lot on meditation recently on the podcast. Just wanted to give a brief introduction of kind of where we've been, and then give you a roadmap of where we're going. Bruce and I did our own podcast on meditation, kind of went through some of the neuromechanisms, default mode network, some very basic tips of how one might include meditation in their life. We then had on my uncle, Bo Bosted, who went through his daily practice and what drew him to a meditation practice over the course of his life. And lastly, we had on a best-selling author of a book focused more on mindfulness, who gave some really great tips. She does corporate seminars and such. Nina Perjwal. She does corporate seminars on mindfulness. So we've had a couple of different aspects of it, but we are extremely excited to have you, join us today and fill in with your perspective. To start things off, I was wondering if you could just tell us, a bit about yourself, how you got into meditation. Where does the story start?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and great to be here with you and to share a little bit of my own experience with meditation. So for me, this has been a very, very personal journey, although it's been a big part of my career and in recent years, the scientific research that I've been involved with. So if I go way back to the beginning, I first started meditating when I was probably about 19 years old. I was a college student, and I'd always been wound a little bit tight, a little anxious as a teenager. And when I got to college, that just went through the roof. I got really anxious, really overwhelmed, really stressed out. And in particular, a lot of social anxiety. So it's ironic that now in my life, I do so much public speaking because I had a phobia, and I'm not exaggerating, like an intense phobia of public speaking back in those years. And so much so that I actually fainted on stage one time. Like, that's how anxious I used to get. So that's really what prompted me to get, to seek out meditation, to want to learn more about it. I didn't know anybody who meditated. It was totally a fringe thing at the time. I mean, it was back in the early 90s, but that got me started. I started meditating every day, and pretty soon it really had completely changed my life. So I've been meditating ever since.
Very good. That makes a lot of sense. So kind of came to it to unwind yourself a bit. And what got you in, again, to your career? Like, what led you to, meditation with your career? Again, and it may tie with Buddhism as well. I know that may tie into your story as well. And feel free to expand upon, that aspect of it as well.
Yeah, I have a very eclectic, circuitous route with my career. If somebody were just to look at it from the outside, there's no real discernible path that probably makes sense as a model anybody else could follow. So I started at that time, when I started meditating, as I said, I was in college and I was very interested in psychology. So I worked in a lab at the time as an undergrad, and we were studying things like intelligence and complex skill acquisition. So it really wasn't anything having to do with meditation. It wasn't even a thing yet in the mainstream scientific world. But I was interested in psychology, so I was kind of doing both at the same time. I then ended up spending many years in Asia. I, at a certain point, got a master's degree in Buddhist studies. I then lived for almost a decade in Tibetan refugee settlements, mainly in Kathmandu, Nepal, but also in India. And it was at that time that I started a nonprofit organization. This is back in 2004. That was my first, real attempt to bring to bring my meditation practice into my career. And basically what happened at that time is I had spent time learning Tibetan. I became fluent in Tibetan at a certain point, and I was beginning to translate these ancient meditation manuals from Tibetan into English. But there was really no way to support myself financially while I was doing it. So I wanted to keep going, but I also needed to make a living and support myself. And I kind of had this feeling of like, okay, world, here I am. I'm ready to help. I'm ready to do my part. But nobody was stepping forward and saying, okay, you're hired. So I thought I'll just start an organization myself. So I did that. That over the years transformed into what is now Tergar International. So I co-founded Tergar with a Tibetan Lama named Mingyur Rinpoche, and that's now a global network of meditation centers. And then even beyond that, a few years after that, I reconnected with my scientific interest. I met a really well-known neuroscientist named Dr. Richard Davidson. He then invited me to come here to Madison, Wisconsin, which is where I live now, and ended up doing a PhD with him. And basically since that time, which was 2016 when I finished my PhD, I've divided my time between Tergar, which is this meditation community, and the Center for Healthy Minds at UW-Madison, where we do research on meditation and the neuroscience of training the mind.
Fantastic. Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah. So I'm just really interested, and it's a topic that Nick and I often talk about when we're speaking offline, and it's why is our school system, because this is so powerful, it seems from the outside looking in that we're missing the boat in teaching this very early on. And I'm curious on your opinion of that, if I'm correct in that observation. But with the amount of time that you spent, in Nepal, just parts of Asia, is that a pretty significant part of their development as a child and as a teenager and adult?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess a few thoughts on that. I mean, if you go back 40, 50, 60 years ago, you'll see that even something that is as well established as it is now, like exercise or a healthy diet, was not nearly as well understood and was not nearly as mainstream, if you go back a number of decades. And it was a combination of scientific research that started to come out and popular interest starting to grow to the point where now it's just commonplace. If you don't exercise, you at least understand the benefits of exercise and the importance of exercise. And you probably feel guilty that you don't exercise if you don't, but everybody understands it. And it's just, a mainstream part of our culture. It's built into education, as you're kind of referring to. Our sense as scientists, and here I'm speaking more from the point of view of the work we do at the Center for Healthy Minds, is that meditation is at a similar place to where exercise was, probably 30 or 40 years ago. The science is really pretty rock solid now, but it's growing by the day. There's starting to be more and more interest in a variety of sectors of our society, from schools to hospitals to organizations to businesses to prisons. I mean, you name it. We've worked with all organizations in virtually every sector of our society. And even in some countries, not as much here in the US, but in the UK, for example, even public policy, like the government has adopted some pretty large scale mindfulness efforts in the UK in the educational system. So I think it's going to happen. I mean, the evidence is just so strong. It's so cost effective. It's not expensive to do. And it's just, it's akin in our view to training the body, where you're essentially training the mind to be more resilient and to be more focused, to be calmer and more caring, in the same way that training the body through exercise and eating healthy essentially trains the body to be more resilient and boosts our immune system. So we're just, I'd say, somewhere along that trajectory, and I think it's beginning to happen, and it'll happen more and more. And as we all know, there's a lot of cultural forces that make it extra complicated. Just the culture wars here in the United States, and a variety of things that probably slow that down and make it more complicated. But to me, it seems inevitable. It's just the evidence is so strong. It's just a no-brainer. Like, why would, as a school system, why would you not do that?
So what you're saying, like many people tell me, is, Bruce, you need to be patient. And that brings up a question that was brought to you on a webinar, and I think it would be really interesting for you to break down. Is, when you use the example of working out, right? And again, the example is of working out. We didn't have the knowledge that we did before, and at least at this point now, even if you're not doing it, you at least know the benefits of it. But you also made the correlation of meditation being a workout. And as we know with working out, right, I can work my chest, I'm working my triceps, I'm working my biceps, I'm working my legs, etc. And from what I got out of that webinar, right, it seems like different meditations work different parts of the brain. Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We use this term meditation, and it sounds like it's one simple thing. And it's, it's easy to get that impression, because if you look from the outside, somebody's just sitting there, apparently doing nothing. But of course, it's what's going on the inside that gets interesting. And meditation is really, akin to exercise, in the sense that there are many, many forms of meditation, literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different forms of meditation. And in the same way that different forms of exercise work different parts of the body, and they affect the physical body in different ways, they're designed to do different things. Different forms of meditation are really just the same, but for the mind. They do different things for the mind. They're designed to have different effects on the mind. And even from a neuroscientific perspective, the evidence is very, very clear and rock solid on this point, that they activate different brain networks. So if you're doing a basic awareness practice, like a mindfulness meditation on the breath, you're likely activating the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that helps, self-regulation, to be more focused, more in the driver's seat of your own experience. And it might activate other networks, for example, part of the brain that's responsible for monitoring what's going on in the body, because of course you're paying attention to a physical process when you pay attention to your breath. But if you look at another form of practice, say one that is designed to cultivate compassion or appreciation, it might still harness the power of that executive network that I mentioned, but it likely brings on entirely different regions in the brain. So there's still a lot of scientific work to do. The field is still in its infancy, but it's pretty clear that it is analogous to physical exercise, and different meditations are doing really different things to the body, the mind, and the brain.
Yep, that's fascinating. Would you mind expanding a bit on the different types of meditation? Because I think that's something that's easily lost. Many people view it as simply the breath work and awareness items. Again, you actually published a paper in 2015, The Cognitive Mechanisms of Meditation. So if anybody wants to check that out, we will link that in the show notes. But I was just hoping you could give us a quick, not a specific number, but of what you're seeing the most popular forms of meditation are currently. What are those most common forms, and what areas of the brain do they interact the most with?
Yeah, as you mentioned, this is definitely an area that I've been very interested in. We've been trying to publish theoretical frameworks to help the scientific community better understand the breadth of meditation practices. That paper that you mentioned being one of them. So in that paper, which is our first attempt to classify all the many forms of meditation, we group them basically into three categories, into three families of meditation. The first is what we refer to as the attentional family. So these are mindfulness practices, awareness practices, basically practices that involve in some way, shape, or form really attending to attentional focus, either widening or narrowing the aperture of awareness, getting the mind to be more focused, more stable, and so on. And that's really the main point of that form of practice or that family of practice. The second family of practice we refer to as the constructive family. And this is completely different. This is not just paying attention to something like the breath or stabilizing your attention on some other object of experience, but rather cultivating, nurturing, developing usually some positive quality. So I mentioned a few moments ago the example of compassion meditation or appreciation meditation. There's a whole body of practices that are all about forming and maintaining healthy relationships. So these would fall into that category. There's other practices. In fact, Bruce, you mentioned patient, like needing to be more patient. Well, there's practices for that, right? There are practices where literally you're training your mind and rewiring your brain so you can be more patient and more grounded, for example. So that whole body of constructive practices is all about having some quality or state of mind that you want to cultivate, and then you systematically strengthen that over time. So you have the attentional practices, these constructive practices, and then the third category is all about what in traditional contexts would have been referred to as wisdom or insight. And it's basically exploratory practices. And the key mechanism in these practices is what we call self-inquiry. But basically, you're exploring your mind and inner experience, and you're gaining insight into the workings of your own mind. So basically, it's giving you insights into the human condition, how the mind works and functions. And we call these deconstructive practices because they're oftentimes deconstructing experience so we can better understand it. So, for example, you might take an emotional experience. Like I mentioned that when I first started meditating, had really, really overwhelming anxiety. So I got a crash course in these kinds of practices at the time. But a lot of my practice in those days was just exploring that meditatively and seeing this monolithic experience that I would label as anxiety was actually a very complex constellation of experiences. There were feelings in my body. There was a loop of thoughts that would play through my mind. There was beliefs that are kind of the undergirding of the whole experience. And as I teased that apart, it actually loosened up the pattern to the point where it just eventually disappeared altogether. So again, these are kind of deconstructive practices. So there are countless practices in each of those families, but that's just one simple way to understand the diversity of meditation practices.
Phenomenal. I think that is extremely insightful stuff. And for our listeners, that paper you wrote on the different cognitive mechanisms of meditation has been cited by, I think, over 700 people by now, which is a massive amount. So clearly, many other scientists in particular have appreciated that work you've done, and has helped them enormously with their work, which is fantastic. I wanted to dive in. I was a neurochemistry major in college, and wanted to dive into some of the neural mechanisms. I first wanted to just go over my very basic understanding based on the research that we had read, and then maybe go into some of the mechanisms, or at least where we're at with the research on perhaps the three different categories you just outlined. But our understanding is that, again, based on some of the papers we read, right, people who meditate a lot, they have the default mode network of the brain, which is a few different areas. They showed greater gray matter in those areas, so greater, larger areas in the prefrontal cortex, but they showed less activity in those areas. So they showed less activity, and less activity in those areas is linked to increased happiness and sense of calm and sense of self. Is that roughly correct? Feel free to correct me if that's completely wrong.
Yeah, it's a little more complicated, and I'll just share a few thoughts on this. The first thing to say about the neuroscience in this area, this is an emerging field that it's coming to be known as contemplative science, or in this case, contemplative neuroscience. Essentially, you can think of it as the neuroscience of training the mind. What happens in the mind and the brain when you train the mind, as we're talking about now. So what makes it complicated is the point we talked about earlier with physical exercise, and how different forms of practice affect the brain differently. You're essentially activating different processes in the mind those mental processes map onto neural processes and neural activity. So if you take something like the default mode network as an example, so for those of you who don't know, for your listeners, the default mode network is this network that corresponds to thought. So basically, if you just sit around and you're not doing anything, and somebody popped you in an fMRI, a big brain scanner, and they looked at what was going on in your brain, it wouldn't be that the brain just goes inactive in some dormant state. Actually, the brain is highly active even when you're sitting doing nothing. So scientists were first puzzled by this because it's not a random pattern of activity, nor is it kind of a state of inactivity in the brain. It's actually a very predictable set of brain regions that becomes active. So the scientists who have studied this, when they looked into what is actually going on when this now what is known as the default mode network becomes active, what they found is that when we're sitting around, for most of us, we're actually thinking. Our minds just start churning out thoughts. We ruminate, we think about what happened in our day or in the distant past, or projecting ourselves into the future and imagining some future scenario that hasn't happened yet. But basically, we're thinking. And we're not just thinking about anything, we're thinking about ourselves. We're all, as it turns out, pretty self-obsessed. So this is the network of self-referential thought, which unfortunately, because it creates problems for mental health, is active a lot of the time, especially when we're not otherwise engaged in some demanding task. So the question that you're raising here, and scientists have looked at this, we've done research on this at the Center for Healthy Minds, is what's going on in the brain of meditators and how does it affect this default mode network? So where it gets complicated is that different forms of meditation affect what's going on in the mind in pretty radically different ways, and therefore they're going to affect this default mode network also in different ways. So for example, there are some forms of meditation, like the now very well known and commonly practiced mindfulness of breathing, like one of the first practices many people learn, where you just learn to bring your awareness back to the breath. You get distracted, you bring it back, and that's basically all you do over and over again, is learn to stay with the breath. So that, if you do that consistently, it has the effect of dampening the activity in this default mode network. So if you look at new meditators, that what you'll likely see is that activity slowly becomes less, or basically that network becomes less and less active. So for example, one of my colleagues, Judd Brewer, who's done some really interesting work, basically showed that even new meditators could deactivate certain nodes in this default mode network in a pretty brief period of time. So that's brain activity, which is different than brain structure, the actual physical, as you were saying, the gray matter or white matter of the brain. So that you're not going to see structural changes right away. But if you imagine that somebody continued that practice and they did that consistently over long periods of time, what you would likely see is a decrease in the kind of the gray matter or white matter structures within the brain. Essentially, because the brain is less and less active and other regions are probably more and more active, the structure of the brain is going to shift in that direction. On the other hand, there are other forms of practice, even within the attentional family that I mentioned a few moments ago, where you actually do something very different. For example, there are practices called open monitoring practices, where you don't try to shift your focus away from the thinking mind, but you actually can bring awareness to the thinking mind. You just take thought activity as the object of your meditation in the same way that you could take the breath as a support for your meditation. So for people who become very adept in a practice like that, you're actually not going to see this dampening of activity in that network. In fact, it might even increase. Therefore, the structural changes are likely to look different. And basically, that's what the research shows, is that depending on the kind of meditation that people are adept at, you actually see different, both functional, which is the activity, and structural changes in the brain. So there's a great paper by a scientist named Kieran Fox, who has done large-scale analyses, what are called meta-analyses, that kind of show these sort of somewhat complex patterns. And again, it really maps on to what forms of practice the meditators are focused on and best at. So it's complicated. If it was just one form of practice and it was very simple, it would be pretty pretty straightforward. But it's kind of like saying, how does exercise affect the body? Just to go back to our analogy, if you looked at a bodybuilder versus a marathon runner, you would see completely different things, right, in the physical body. It's basically like that for meditation.
Understood. Makes a lot of sense. And as we know that activity is correlated with the changes in structure, where are we at in the research in terms of understanding the mechanisms by which those areas like get bigger or smaller? Do we know that yet, or is that still an unknown? We just know that it's correlated. When you have more activity, it gets larger in these specific areas.
Well, there's this cliche in neuroscience that you hear all the time, that neurons that fire together wire together. So basically, that just means that, as you kind of pair different experiences, there are corresponding patterns of activity in the brain that represent different regions kind of activating together, co-activating. So one of the things that scientists look at is patterns of connectivity between these different networks and different brain and different regions in the brain. So as these different brain regions start to activate more and more regularly, say that corresponds with a practice like meditating on your breath, you're essentially over and over activating sets of brain regions in a particular constellation, like a particular pattern of brain regions activating at the same time. And over time, those connections are just going to grow. Again, it's not too dissimilar. It's like a much more complex version of just doing a physical movement. And there's going to be certain muscles that are kind of activating at the same time, and they'll kind of grow together if you continue that same movement and kind of regular intervals. So the biochemistry, underlying that is quite complex, as you might imagine. I'm sure you've heard about neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. Basically, the idea that the brain is constantly changing in response to experience. So there's biological mechanisms that allow this to happen and facilitate that happening. But the brain is overwhelmingly complex, and so the exact mechanisms through which it occurs are still very hard to get a handle on.
Beyond interesting, and I want to stay on this same train of thought, because when you look at, you talked about in a previous webinar that really stuck out for me is, a youthful brain, right? And the activation and the act of meditation is creating a more youthful brain. And there's a couple things also that were mentioned, right? Like you mentioned toxic information. So I'm throwing a lot at you right now, but there's just so much, and I only have you but for so much time. Right? I know, well, the neuroscience, I'd say that we have a fingerprint on, and you more so than probably many, many others. But the awareness piece, right? I understand that when I listen to, in the morning on my morning walks, I listen to a classical music or I listen to a motivational speech, like I feel better. I feel youthful. Like I can feel that. But then I also know if I listen to certain metal songs or certain hip hop songs, like I feel angry. I feel that toxic information that you talk about. And when you talk about, and I don't know if this correlates, but when you take that to how meditation, mindfulness, how that creates a youthful brain, can you just touch on that? Because I think it's so important. I think it misses the boat, especially in pop culture. I think it misses the boat in our youth. And as I'm getting older, the same reason why I'm working out is, while my skin may lose its elasticity, I want to be able to function. I want to be able to pick my kids up. I want to have grandkids and be able to kick the soccer ball with them. Can you just touch on that?
Yeah. Lots of great things to pick up on there. The first thing to share a little bit about is this. I think what you're referring to is a case study that we did. This is with a meditation teacher, actually the same meditation teacher who I mentioned earlier that I've worked closely with, who's named Mingyur Rinpoche, Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche. And we did a case study because he's been in the center for years, many, many times. Richie Davidson, the neuroscientist I mentioned earlier, he's basically done a number of studies on him and scanned his brain many times. And about 5-6 years ago, a little bit more than that actually right now, maybe 6-7 years ago, he did basically a 5-year retreat. He just walked out of his monastery in the middle of the night by himself and spent 5 years wandering in the Himalayas and throughout India, just meditating basically full time. And when he came back, Richie asked if he could come into the lab and if we could scan his brain again just to see what we found. And the paper that was published based on the scans, really got some attention because it showed some pretty dramatic findings related to what scientists refer to as brain age. So basically, if you look at the normal age-related deterioration in the brain over time, it's quite predictable. And scientists have basically an algorithm where they can kind of measure where somebody is at, correlating measuring their brain age, or just the age-related decline in the brain relative to their chronological age. So is your brain aging faster or slower than a typical person at your age, basically? And what they found with Mingyur Rinpoche was that he was off the charts. He was basically at the very far end of the distribution, as we would say in science, statistically speaking, in terms of his brain age. His brain was far, far younger than his chronological age. So that was quite interesting. I should say that this was just a single case study. This was not a randomized controlled trial. It would be extremely difficult to do something like this with a rigorous RCT, but it was enough just to maybe say, oh, okay, maybe there's really something here. And it also corresponds to other findings from related fields of scientific research that have shown, for example, that things like distractibility, for example, increase the brain's aging, or even our biological aging mechanisms. So there's something called telomeres, for example, which are the caps on the end of chromosomes, and those basically get shorter and shorter as we age, and you can measure them as a biological marker of the aging process. So things like toxic levels of distraction tend to speed up the aging process or the shortening of those telomeres, while things like meditation seem to slow that down. So there's findings like that, for example, that all play into what you're mentioning. So in short, I think that what's going on here is quite complex, and the science in this area, again, is very, very new. I would say we have a lot more questions than we have answers at this point from a purely empirical point of view and a biological point of view. But if I step back and I had to guess what is going on here, and again, I'll say that I'll just reinforce the point that this is not, we don't yet have solid data here. I think a lot of what's going on when we learn to meditate is we're just better understanding what's going on in our mind and how doing different things affect our mental state, and how our mental state in turn affects our overall quality of life, our sense of mental health, emotional well-being, inner balance, and just resilience, how quickly we recover when something challenging happens. Do we get stuck, with frustration or depression or anxiety or anger, or can we have a stressful day and bounce back, and a few hours later we're all right and we're ready to go? So again, you mentioned a number of different things, but related to this is that when we meditate, we start to see that information is to our mind what food is to the body. We are essentially feeding our minds information all the time. And 100 years ago, that diet was probably much smaller, but now we are flooded with information. We have our phones in our pockets. Every spare second, we're reading something or listening to something. We rarely just turn off and are just existing. We're just constantly taking in and consuming information. So if you imagine, with your physical diet, if you really paid attention to what you eat and how it makes you feel, you'd start to notice all sorts of different things. You'd notice that certain foods would make you sleepy. Other foods would make you energetic. Some foods you might not notice right away, but 6 hours later, you'd notice some kind of delayed effect. You'd just start noticing and be much more sensitive to how the food you're taking in is affecting your physical health and the state of your body. So it's basically like that with the mind. You start noticing, as you said, listening to certain things, maybe some music, you start to see, wow, that just puts me in an aggressive, unhealthy frame of mind. And I just don't want to do that anymore. So I'm going to maybe eliminate that. It's just like you would do something with your diet. And you notice the things that put you in a positive state of mind. So basically, that's the general principle. And it's really helpful, actually. Like for me, for example, I've noticed my with my phone, I noticed that if I leave that in my bedroom, it was the last thing in my hand before I went to bed. And it's the first thing that I pick up when I'd wake up in the morning. And I just noticed that my mind was just not in a good state when I'm just doom scrolling or checking messages or whatever before I go to bed or first thing in the morning. So I made a choice that I don't even bring my phone into my room. I leave it downstairs. I don't touch it. And I just noticed my mental state is much better than going to bed and waking up in the morning. So again, it just makes you more sensitive and conscious of these choices that we make all the time.
Fantastic. And you mentioned phone, so I'm going to ask you're also involved with the Healthy Minds app, and that's an extremely popular meditation app. You've also done research on the effectiveness of meditation apps back in 2020. Where are we at with that? Are we finding that those apps are very helpful? How can people use these apps to start to build a meditation practice into their life?
Yeah, we've been really pleasantly surprised about the findings on our research using technology to help people learn these skills and these practices. We originally built the Healthy Minds program app really for research purposes. We wanted to study all of these different practices. There was no standardized way and standardized tools to do that other than things like mindfulness-based stress reduction, which gets at mindfulness, but not other practices. So we built the app, and we're quite surprised that it started getting a lot of traction. At some point, the New York Times recommended it as one of their 3 top meditation apps, which we were totally shocked by. But from there, it really started getting a lot of traction, and so it's reached a lot more people than we ever anticipated it would. But we've been doing really, really rigorous scientific research on this, and other teams at some of the leading research institutions have been doing it as well. There are teams at MIT, at NYU, Arizona, Virginia, a whole bunch of universities are doing research on the Healthy Minds program. And the findings so far are quite remarkable. For example, we did a study, a very rigorous randomized controlled trial with 600, or I think almost 700 school employees, mostly teachers, during the pandemic. And we found that just 4.5 minutes a day of using the Healthy Minds program app, so just doing short guided practices, listening to short podcast style lessons and the kind of stuff we're talking about now, made a dramatic difference in their mental health over the course of 1 month. So just a few minutes of practice a day, they were decreasing depression, anxiety, levels of stress by up to 30%, and increasing positive things like feelings of social connectedness, things like mindfulness and attentiveness, just the basic building blocks of mental health and emotional balance. They were able to really significantly improve all of these things in just minutes a day. And we've now done similar randomized controlled trials with other populations. We're actually just in the course of doing an even bigger RCT with school employees in Louisville. And we're also doing another one specifically with people struggling with mental health issues. And there we're doing some really pioneering stuff, like looking at the microbiome and epigenetic factors to see how these practices can even influence the flora of your gut, as strange as that may seem. And there's preliminary evidence that is indeed the case, that you can actually train your mind and it's going to change your biology, even literally how your gut is functioning and digesting food, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah, no, it really is. And this is touching back on the age of your brain, but for instance, working out, taking it back to that analogy or that example, is we have a scale that we can hop on. right? We have body fat calipers that we can look and measure. What can we do? What can our listeners do to sort of get that baseline?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is another area that we are working a lot uh, on because right now um, there are very few good measures of the core constituents of well being, of mental health, emotional balance, things like that. So, one of the things we've been doing is digitizing the gold standard scientific measures we use in the lab. Like we have one of them. One we developed is in the Healthy Minds app now. It's a self-report measure, which is not the most rigorous way, but these are scientifically validated tools. So, like in the Healthy Minds app, for example, which is completely free and you can get it in any of the app stores, you basically answer a series of questions. And this has been scientifically validated with thousands of people. And you basically just get a snapshot of your well-being along what we call the 4 pillars of well-being. And then you can do practices and do the Healthy Minds program and see how that changes over time. We've also developed a number of other measures that we haven't put in the app yet. We actually got a large grant from the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation to do this. And we digitize these measurements, and we're now in the process of creating a platform where ordinary people can actually use them to measure their mental health and well-being. Um, but the lack of good measurements is really a big issue, and we see it as one of the main impediments to this really having a much wider societal benefit. So we're working very hard to do that. And just to give you an example of the kind of the gaps that exist, not necessarily from a scientific point of view, but how it filters down into just people's ordinary lives. If you go to the doctor and your physical health, is not doing so great, the doctor will almost certainly ask you about your diet, whether you're exercising. In more recent years, they'll probably start asking about drinking enough water, are you sleeping well, and things like that. These are all well known, scientifically, and they're very commonplace in the medical establishment to be checking on these things, to measure them, and to help people basically get support so they can improve these things. But what people don't often know is that the mental factors have as big an effect on physical health as a lot of these other things. So, for example, feeling lonely or feeling socially disconnected is equal to smoking 15 cigarettes a day in the risk it is to physical health. So this is just recently the Surgeon General Vivek Murthy has been talking a lot about this. But you never hear about that if you go to a doctor. They're not going to say, hey, how are your relationships? And if your relationships are struggling, if you're feeling lonely or whatever, they're not going to give you anything to help with that. It's a bigger risk factor than obesity. It's a bigger risk factor for physical health than not exercising or not drinking enough water. It's only smoking is on that same level. So, and we know, our scientific work shows pretty definitively that you can improve your sense of feeling connected socially, feeling cared for, and having the ability to care for others by doing these simple practices like we have in the Healthy Minds app, or we teach in the Tergar community. So there's simple things you can do that make a real difference, but we need to be able to measure that. We need to get these tools into people's hands because it's just not nearly as well understood in healthcare, for example, or in the wider kind of mainstream pop culture as the obvious things like diet and exercise are. That's changing, but there's still a lot of work to do.
No, fascinating, and that is a phenomenal read on where we are and where we hope to go. So thank you for that. I have one last topic. I know we're nearly up on time, but you mentioned you had referenced him a couple of times before, Mingyur Rinpoche, one of the other main leaders of the Tergar community, who has a phenomenal way of explaining things in his own way. Can you touch on Buddhism? Obviously, that's played a large part in your journey as well. Do you view that as, there's a lot of these Buddhist principles that we're applying through the scope of mindfulness? Are they like different gears that you think about, in your head? How does that work?
Yeah, That's a great question. So Mingyur Rinpoche, who you mentioned, is a Tibetan Buddhist teacher. I mentioned him earlier. He's the Lama who did those years of retreat, and he's also been a scientific collaborator. So he was some of the earliest studies on meditation, which happened now more than 20 years ago. He was one of a small group of what they refer to as Olympian meditators. Monks largely who've spent 30, 40, even 50,000 hours in meditation over the course of their lifetime. So this is just an extraordinary amount of training the mind. And it's, perhaps no accident that most of the scientists who studied Mingyur Rinpoche and his brain have since become students of his, wanting to learn how to meditate, both because the results were so dramatic. Like at certain points, they actually thought the machinery was broken because they were seeing such profound, dramatic patterns of brain activity that had never been demonstrated before. But also just, when you're around teachers like this, meditation masters who've so thoroughly trained their mind, it's just inspiring, and it's kind of infectious to a certain degree. So he certainly is one such individual. For my money, I think he's, maybe I don't want to say the best teacher, but just a really gifted teacher of the practice as well. Like, how do you actually meditate? So I think when it comes to Buddhism, it's something that at first, just to speak to my personal experience, I was not at all interested in the religious aspects of this when I first started practicing. In fact, I had an active allergy to anything that resembled organized religion. Wanted to keep it at arm's length. But I think, after a number of years, just got drawn more and more to the Buddhist tradition. There were a few things that, I think were probably critical in that process, or made it work for me. I don't think it's for everybody. You certainly don't have to be Buddhist to meditate. If you've got another faith tradition, or you're agnostic or atheist or whatever, that's totally fine. There's no need, I think, to even check it out. But for me, I think what made it a good fit for me is, I think first is that having a healthy skepticism is not only allowed, but actually it's part of the path. Asking hard questions, inquiring, examining, is really part of the Buddhist approach. There's this famous quote that I'm going to paraphrase here, goes something like, you shouldn't believe, what you read in a book just because it's written by some famous person. You shouldn't believe something just because it's what your parents believed, or what your culture, the views your culture has. You should rigorously test and examine anything you hear and put it to the test of your own experience. And if you really see that it rings true in your own experience, then you can adopt it. And that to me really fit with my own kind of scientific skepticism. So I think it was that. The other piece that I found really helpful is that Buddhism is an atheistic tradition. It's not based on beliefs or a creed or kind of adopting a new belief system. It's ultimately practical. It's really almost more akin to psychology than a religion, in that it's really a very practical exploration of the human mind that's all centered around the question of, why do we suffer? Why do we, get caught in loops that create and perpetuate states of suffering or dissatisfaction? And how can we find our way out of that? So ultimately, it's just very practical human questions. And for me, I've found that path a very rich and rewarding one. It certainly has inspired a lot of the scientific work. There's many practices in the Buddhist tradition that I think are great, candidates for scientific inquiry. So it's given me lots of ideas about what we can study and what we can learn from a more rigorous scientific perspective. So that's just a little bit about my own personal journey, but it has been indeed a very important part of my own life.
Of course, and we very much appreciate your sharing. Well, I want to be mindful of your calendar. I know that we are up on time, but if you wanted to, we will link in our show notes the app and the website. But how would if a listener wanted to get involved with Tergar and learn more about this or delve into your world, what would be the best way for someone to do that?
Yeah, I would say, as I mentioned earlier, whether we're talking about Buddhism or Tergar or the Healthy Minds program or any of these, we're all different. Different things work for different people. I'm a big believer that there's no one size fits all approach. I think the meditation that is the best is the one that works best for you. And the practice that works best is the one you will actually do. So I think if it's an early stage, I think just, looking around, checking things out and seeing what resonates is the best approach. With Tergar and with Mingyur Rinpoche, there's, countless videos and things online. The actual step-by-step course of training that he developed is called The Joy of Living. So he actually has a book called The Joy of Living, which is one of the best books to get started in meditation. So that's a great read if you're a reader. And then there is an online course that you can do. There's events around the world as well that are basically work through the core steps of learning to meditate. So that's one simple way. If you just want to check it out, you can go on YouTube. He's got countless of videos on YouTube and elsewhere that are just will give you a kind of a sense for Mingyur Rinpoche as a teacher and the style of meditation practice in the Tergar community. And the Healthy Minds app, which we've mentioned a few times. Again, you can just go onto any app store and put in Healthy Minds program. And again, completely free, no paywall, no freemium or anything like that. We've made this completely free to anybody who wants to use it. So those are two options, but of course there's many, many others. There's many great ways to learn to meditate. So you could check things out and see what resonates. But what I would say is, I think even if you just do 2 or 3 minutes a day or 5 minutes a day, what I noticed when I first started meditating is I meditated off and on. I would read a book and get all excited, and then I'd meditate for a few weeks. And then I'd kind of lose my motivation and I'd stop for a month or two. And then I'd again read something and again get excited. And it was beneficial in that up and down period. But there was a point at which I started meditating for 20 minutes every day. And that is when things really started to change in my mind. I think it was within a matter of months, probably like 5 or 6 months, that it just felt like my mind was just radically different. I was so much more focused. I had always been restless and a little agitated, and suddenly I just felt calm and confident and relaxed. It was just like I had tapped into some wellspring of kind of mental energy that I didn't even know I had. So I think even if it's a few minutes a day, just doing it regularly and consistently for a number of months, and then I've just talked to countless people who've had a similar experience. You'll notice a difference, if you stick with it for a while.
Absolutely, and I don't think we could have given any possible better advice. As I said, we are eternally grateful for you sharing your story. The theme of this podcast is against the herd and not being afraid to make your own path. You certainly did that, and have really amazing things to share from your journey. So I just wanted to really thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys.